Hi, I'm Melissa Huden, and this video will be about my final infographic for Info 424 at the University of Washington. The topic of my infographic was Yosemite National Park. With this display, I am attempting to communicate to the audience general information about the park, such as which seasons have the most visitors, where it is located, and what activities are available at different times of the year. Here's a brief look at the models that I used throughout the process of creating my infographic. They can also be found on the models page of my portfolio site. As I go through the different components of my infographic, I will often reference these models as the basis for design decisions that I made. In this section, I'm going to talk about visual potential and how it relates to my infographic. There are several different kinds of visual potential found within my infographic. The first kind of visual potential is number potential. In my infographic, I use two number displays. The first is a display of the number of visitors to the park by month, down below here. I chose to represent this visually with circles. The larger the circle is, the greater the number of visitors to the park that month. I also emphasize some important numbers below in the text. The other number display that I used represents the number of bears sighted in different areas of the park. I chose a pie chart to represent this data because it allows the viewer to see the whole area, representing the 75 total bear sightings, as well as the different pieces of the pie that correspond to sightings in specific areas. The larger the slice is, the more bears were sighted in that area. The second kind of visual potential is location potential. The idea that I chose to represent with location potential was Yosemite National Park in relation to the state of California. For this reason, my display shows the state of California with its major cities and its major roadways, and also where Yosemite sits within the state. Then, off to the side, I showed a larger display of Yosemite itself, showing where some important landmarks and regions of the park are. Next is appearance potential. For my infographic, I used quite a few appearance displays, mostly in the form of photos. The display of Half Dome down here is the largest because I really wanted viewers to connect this iconic image with the park. Up on the right here, there are some pictures of animals because I wanted to convey that there are lots of animals on the way up the hike to Half Dome. On the top right of the infographic, I chose a couple of pictures to compare Yosemite to another famous national park, Yellowstone. And so I chose the most iconic pictures I felt of both, the mountain waterfall scenery of Yosemite and the thermal features of Yellowstone. This is Old Faithful. For the timeline, I chose some smaller visual elements to help viewers picture what the park was like in the different times. For relationship potential, I decided to show the relationship between activities in Yosemite and the seasons in which they are available. I did this by creating this chart here that has 4 quadrants, and then I put activities corresponding to seasons in a particular quadrant. For example, all the activities corresponding to spring are in this quadrant. And then if an activity corresponds to more than one season, I put it between the seasons. So you can see waterfalls in both spring and in summer. For my time display, I decided to show Yosemite's history through a timeline. This meant spacing the events very carefully to represent the amount of time between them accurately. It was difficult to choose a small number of events because Yosemite has a long history. In this section, I'm going to talk about the encodings that I used in my infographic. First, I'll explain the encodings found in my number displays. For my display about the number of visitors to the park, the size of a circle conveys the magnitude. So these larger circles mean that more visitors came to the park in these months. For the bear data display, size also conveys magnitude because the larger the slice of the pie chart is, the more bears have been found in that location. I thought that these displays were intuitive because it's easy to relate the larger size to a larger number. Another potential way of representing this information that I thought of was through a bar graph, where the height of the bar represents the magnitude. I chose not to use a bar graph because it didn't seem to fit as well with the visual language of my model. There weren't any rectangular shapes, they were more curvy shapes. In my location display, I used space on the page to represent space between objects in the real world. This means that the location of Yosemite within California, in my infographic, is representative of the actual location of Yosemite within California in the real world. I couldn't really think of another way to encode this location information because I knew that I wanted to show Yosemite within the state of California and that I needed to do that with both space and size. In my relationship display, I used the position of the icons on the page to convey the relationship. So the icons that belong to a specific season were placed within the quadrant corresponding to that season. Another way that I thought of encoding this information was through colors, where each season would have a color. I ended up not being able to do that because my color model has a limited number of colors. But I did think that it would be intuitive for viewers as long as the colors were different enough that it was easy to distinguish between them. In my time display, I used relative position on the page to convey time. Farther to the left is earlier and farther to the right is later in time. This allows the space between the yellow circles to convey the amounts of time, a longer distance meaning a longer amount of time between the two events. Another way that I thought of displaying time was in a circle where starting at the top would be the beginning and time would increase going clockwise. So this seems kind of intuitive because it's like a clock, but then in the end I thought that the timeline would be better for the viewers because people are more used to seeing timelines. In this section, I'll talk about how I used color in my infographic. So the colors that I used in my infographic were tan, green, red, and yellow. You can see them in the model infographic. There's tan for the background, and then you've got the green for most of the text, the body text, all these labels, some small graphical elements. And then there's yellow, which is used for just graphical elements. And there's red, which is used for titles, and then sometimes for subtitles, as you can see over here. So in my infographic, I copied this by making the whole background tan. It shows through for some text and numbers. It doesn't really happen in the model infographic, but I needed to do this because otherwise I wouldn't be able to put labels over green graphical elements. So I changed that, and then I used solid green and yellow for all the graphical elements and made all the body text green as well as the title for my whole infographic. I used yellow to highlight when there are graphical elements that have both green and yellow, such as in the display that has the number of visitors to the park. And as a whole, I was hoping that the green, yellow, and rusty red color scheme would help the viewer associate the infographic with the outdoors and nature, and maybe park service uniforms. In the color model, I think they're trying to do the same type of things. They talk about car crashes happening. Well, obviously they happen outside, but they do talk about them happening in rural areas. And then they kind of bring up the point of the uniform too down here when they ask people to buckle up and they show this kind of authority figure cap. I think that the color usage as a whole sets a calm, grounded, and earthy tone because of the darker green, which is reminiscent of forest scenery. And the yellow is bright, but not overwhelmingly so, and kind of balanced by the mildness of the green color. I think this is intentional because the model infographic wants to give a calm and factual view of the statistics, but also highlight important points in the data with a brighter color, which would be the yellow. And the color harmony was analogous because all the colors lie within the same quadrant on the color wheel. Now I'll talk a little about the text used in my infographic. Alright, I'll start by going over how text is used in my typography model. There's a cursive font, which is only used for the title of the whole infographic, and then there are two serif fonts. One seems to be similar to Baskerville, and it's used for all the section headers. And then there's another serif font, which looks like it might be something like Georgia, and that gets used for all the body text. They also bold a lot of important points. In addition, there's a sans serif font, which gets used either for subsection headers or sometimes to label important numbers, as you can see here. So you can see that I tried to follow my typography model by using the cursive font only for the header. I ended up using something called Simple Snails. Then I used a Baskerville-like font for all the section headers, as you can see here, here, and here. I used Georgia for the body text and I bolded important points. And then I felt like it might be a slight departure to use Georgia for the subheadings here, like I did, because normally the subheadings in my model were in the sans serif font, but I had already used the sans serif font to highlight numbers, as they did also do in the model infographic, so I felt that that was justifiable, because I needed the event title to look different from the number. And then in the model, I used Georgia for both annotations and body text, so you can see it in the annotations here that give more information about Half Dome. And in some cases, I used these dotted lines to connect the annotations to the part of the display that they're referring to, and this comes from my base model. They used a lot of dashed lines like that in my base model. Then I used a sans serif font for numbers, as you can see here, and also for some subheadings. For example, in the relationship display, I used it for subheadings. For precision labels, such as the one giving the height of Half Dome or the numbers of bears found in the park, I used a sans serif font. And then for identity labels, I used the Georgia font in all caps, as seen in several places in my typography model. In the model, labels are associated with what they label by proximity, so I tried to mimic that by making the labels really close to what they're referring to.